On the outside he was everything a community could ask for: clean-cut, God-fearing, a man who preached peace and forgiveness every Sunday morning. Pastor Leonard Jacobs was a familiar face in town, known for his comforting sermons and picture-perfect family. He baptized children, married couples, and even counseled families on how to stay together. To his congregation he was a shepherd, a moral compass, a man chosen by God. But behind the pulpit, behind the carefully tailored suits and polite smiles, lived a man tormented by control, pride, and a darkness few could imagine. To the untrained eye, the Jacobs family looked like the embodiment of traditional values. Leonard's wife, Naomi, was soft-spoken, reserved, and deeply loyal to her husband. They had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, both frequently seen at Sunday school and church picnics. And then there was Naomi's mother, Elaine, the ever-watchful mother-in-law who never quite trusted the man her daughter married. As time passed, whispers began circulating quietly in the pews. Whispers about strange arguments at home. About Naomi's frequent visits to her mother's house. About a different side of Pastor Leonard, a side filled with rage and manipulation, a side only his family truly knew. But no one wanted to believe it. Not until it was too late. In the early hours of a chilly October morning, those whispers turned into screams. Elaine Carter, Naomi's mother and grandmother to Leonard's children, was found dead in her home. Brutally assaulted. Murdered. The crime shook the quiet community to its core. And when the details emerged, when the truth finally crawled into the light, it left a stain on the church that no prayer could wash away. Only days before Elaine's murder, Leonard had lost something he couldn't stomach: custody of his 2 children. The court had seen through his righteous mask. And in his mind, Elaine was the one who tipped the scale. She had stood beside her daughter. She had testified. She had tried to protect her family. And for that, she paid with her life. This is the story of how a trusted spiritual leader became the very monster he once preached against. A story of family torn apart, of justice delayed but not denied, and of how evil can wear the face of holiness. This is the family crime exposed. From the moment Leonard Jacobs stepped into Naomi Carter's life, he exuded charisma. He wasn't just charming, he was magnetic. A young pastor with a rising voice in the pulpit, Leonard knew how to move a crowd, how to make people believe in his words, and in him. Naomi, soft-hearted and deeply spiritual, fell fast and fell hard. Her mother, Elaine, however, was never quite convinced. Elaine Carter was not an overly suspicious woman, but she was a mother. And mothers can see what others don't. Where others saw a devoted man of God, Elaine noticed something different. Something carefully concealed in Leonard's eyes. A possessiveness. A desire to control. A hunger for dominance disguised as devotion. Still, Naomi insisted her mother give Leonard a chance. He had grown up rough, abandoned by his parents, shuffled through foster homes, and saved, he claimed, by the church. He said God had given him a second chance. And Naomi, filled with compassion, believed him. They married within a year. The wedding was modest but beautiful. Leonard wore his clerical collar proudly, and Naomi beamed beside him. To their congregation, it was a union blessed from above. But behind the wedding photos and polished sermons, a very different story was already unfolding. Not long after the honeymoon, the cracks began to show. Leonard's charm, which once seemed so comforting, began to harden into control. He insisted on knowing where Naomi was at all times. Her friends, especially the ones he didn't approve of, slowly faded from her life. He monitored her phone. He made comments about her clothes, her tone, even the way she spoke in public. At first, Naomi rationalized it. He was just protective. Maybe a little old-fashioned. Maybe even a bit insecure. But Elaine knew better. Elaine saw her daughter's light beginning to dim. She watched Naomi become quieter, more withdrawn, her once bright spirit shrinking into silence. When Elaine tried to ask questions, Naomi would dodge or deflect, never wanting to upset her husband, never wanting to cause trouble. Still, Naomi stayed. Because like many women raised to believe in traditional family values, she thought enduring hardship was part of being a good wife. And Leonard knew that. He preyed on it. In public, Leonard played the role flawlessly. At church functions, he praised Naomi from the pulpit. He would thank her for being his rock, his queen, his godly wife. And people clapped. They believed the illusion. But Elaine never did. She made herself a constant presence in Naomi's life. Frequent visits, daily phone calls, unannounced drop-ins. Leonard hated it. He once called her meddling, another time a spirit of division. But Elaine didn't care. She saw what Leonard was doing. Slowly but surely she began documenting things. Text messages, bruises, sudden hospital visits with vague explanations. She was building a case, even when her daughter wasn't ready to face the truth. Then came the children. Two little lives that brought both joy and tension. Leonard was obsessed with control, and fatherhood gave him a new realm to dominate. He dictated what the children could watch, who they could play with, what they could eat. He insisted on homeschooling, not out of spiritual conviction but because it kept them under his thumb. Naomi, meanwhile, was unraveling. The stress, the fear, the constant pressure to submit, it was breaking her spirit. And Elaine watched it all, helpless but determined not to be silent. When Naomi finally broke down in front of her one night, tear-streaked and trembling, Elaine knew it was time to act. Together they filed for separation. Elaine helped Naomi find a lawyer, gather evidence, and prepare for a custody battle. Leonard didn't take it well. In fact, he lost it. He painted himself as the victim, telling his congregation that his wife had been led astray by outside influences. He hinted at demonic forces. He accused Elaine of witchcraft, yes, witchcraft, claiming she had poisoned his marriage. But the courts weren't swayed by his theatrics. Elaine took the stand during the custody hearings. Calm, composed, factual. She told them about the bruises, about the controlling behavior, about the threats whispered when no one was around. She presented recordings and medical records. She didn't speak as a mother scorned, she spoke as a witness to slow, systemic abuse. And for the first time someone listened. The court granted Naomi full custody. Leonard was allowed limited, supervised visitation. He was furious. And Naomi, though still fearful, felt the first breath of fresh air in years. But Elaine? She stayed vigilant. She knew Leonard wasn't done. And she was right. Because a man like Leonard Jacobs, whose entire identity was wrapped in power and control, could not accept defeat. Not from a judge. Not from his wife. And certainly not from a woman he had always considered beneath him. To him, Elaine had robbed him of everything. His family, his reputation, his authority. She had exposed him. Humiliated him. And deep inside his twisted mind, he decided that someone had to pay for that. 4 years, Leonard Jacobs controlled every part of his household like a well-rehearsed sermon. Every word spoken, every decision made, every step taken within the walls of his home, he had the final say. His authority wasn't questioned. His rules weren't bent. And to the outside world, he cloaked that dominance in religious righteousness. But the custody battle stripped away that illusion. When Naomi filed for separation, she did more than challenge Leonard's control, she exposed it. She opened a door into the darkness he had hidden for years, and Leonard knew it. And as that courtroom process began, he made one thing very clear. He wasn't going to let go of his children without a fight. It started with appearances. Leonard arrived in court dressed like a saint, always in a crisp suit, clutching a Bible, flanked by a few loyal church members who believed every word he said. He painted himself as the victim of a smear campaign led by a vindictive wife and a controlling mother-in-law. He claimed he was a devoted father, unfairly accused by women who didn't understand biblical submission. His legal team leaned heavily into his image, pastor, leader, father, hoping it would shield him from scrutiny. But Naomi's side had something far more powerful, truth. Elaine had spent months gathering evidence. Naomi had finally found the courage to document years of abuse, screenshots of threatening messages, photographs of bruises, and diary entries that told a haunting story of isolation and fear. Naomi's attorney presented all of it in court, piece by piece, building a timeline that shattered Leonard's holy image. Witnesses were called. Former church members who had seen glimpses of Leonard's temper. A family friend who recalled Naomi showing up at her door one night with the children, shaking and terrified. Even a pediatrician testified about concerning injuries the children had suffered, injuries Leonard had always brushed off as accidents. Then Elaine took the stand. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told the truth. About how her daughter had changed after marrying Leonard. About the excuses, the silences, the way Naomi stopped laughing. She told the court about late-night phone calls, whispering conversations, the fear she saw in her grandchildren's eyes. And she made one thing clear. Leonard wasn't a man of God. He was a man obsessed with power. Leonard's composure began to crack. Each day in court chipped away at the mask he wore so well. His eyes, once filled with righteous fury, began to flicker with desperation. He interrupted testimony, whispered angrily to his lawyer, glared at Naomi and Elaine from across the room. But the judge saw through it. The turning point came when audio recordings were submitted into evidence. In one, Leonard could be heard shouting at Naomi, screaming biblical phrases twisted into weapons of fear. In another, the children could be heard crying in the background as Leonard berated their mother, threatening to take them far away where no one would ever find them. The courtroom fell silent. And in that silence, the truth finally settled in. Leonard Jacobs wasn't the man he claimed to be. He was a tyrant behind closed doors. And the court acted accordingly. The judge awarded Naomi full custody. Leonard was granted only supervised visitation at a court-approved center. No contact outside of scheduled appointments, no overnight stays, no exceptions. It was a devastating blow to Leonard's pride. But more than that, it was a public stripping of everything he held dear: authority, image, and most importantly, control. To Leonard, this wasn't justice. It was humiliation. The ruling didn't just remove his children. It removed his mask. And it forced his congregation to ask questions. Questions he couldn't answer with a verse or a prayer. The day the judge read the final order, Leonard didn't even look at Naomi. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked out of the courtroom without a word. But as he passed Elaine in the gallery, he turned his head just slightly. And in that moment she saw it, the quiet rage, the silent vow. It wasn't over. For Leonard, the court had made him a prisoner in his own skin. A man without his children, without his image, and without the power he believed was his divine right. And in the twisted corners of his mind, there was only one person to blame: Elaine. He believed she had poisoned Naomi. That she had turned the children against him. That she had stood between him and God's plan. In his world of delusion and domination, she had committed the ultimate betrayal. And now, as he sat alone in his house, surrounded by silence, that betrayal festered. It grew into obsession. Into hatred. Into something far more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. Because when a man like Leonard loses control, he doesn't let go. He retaliates. And Elaine? She had no idea what was coming. After the court stripped Leonard Jacobs of custody, something inside him shattered. To the world, he pretended to carry on, still showing up at his church, still delivering sermons about forgiveness, endurance, and the tests of faith. But behind closed doors, the pastor wasn't praying. He was plotting. He believed he had been robbed, not just of his children but of his manhood, his legacy, his divine authority. He didn't see the court's ruling as justice. He saw it as betrayal. And in his eyes, one woman had orchestrated it all: Elaine Carter. In Leonard's mind, Elaine wasn't just Naomi's mother. She was the enemy. The serpent in the garden. The puppet master who had pulled Naomi away from his influence and destroyed the life he built. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Calm, composed, defiant. And the thought of it consumed him. He became obsessed. Neighbors noticed Leonard rarely left his house except for church services. Some said they saw him pacing at night, whispering to himself in the backyard. Others claimed he stopped returning calls. The once sociable, charismatic pastor had gone cold, withdrawn, unpredictable. And then came the journals, pages filled with ramblings about betrayal, vengeance, and divine punishment. The entries were dark, violent, laced with scripture twisted into threats. But no one knew. No one saw the full picture. Not yet. Naomi, finally beginning to rebuild her life, started to let her guard down. The children were healing. The home was calmer. Elaine remained ever-present, helping with school drop-offs, weekend meals, and bedtime stories. But behind her gentle strength, Elaine never truly relaxed. She knew Leonard, knew the way he thought, and she sensed it, the tension in the air, the silence that felt too loud. She told Naomi to change her routine, to check the locks, to watch her back. And Naomi did until the night it happened. October 14th. A Friday. Elaine had gone back to her own home after spending the evening helping with the kids' homework. It was late, almost 11 p.m., but she didn't live far, just a 10-minute drive. She texted Naomi when she got in. Home safe. See you in the morning. It was the last message she would ever send. According to surveillance footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, a tall man approached Elaine's home just after midnight. Dressed in dark clothes, face hidden beneath a hoodie. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. He used a key. Leonard still had one. Inside, Elaine had likely just settled into bed when she heard the door open. Maybe she thought it was Naomi. Maybe she thought something had happened. But when she walked into that hallway, she came face to face with a man she had always feared, and always tried to protect her daughter from. No one knows exactly what was said. No one heard the screams, if there were any at all. But what happened inside that house was nothing short of horrific. Leonard assaulted her, brutally. Not just physically, but sexually. A violent, rage-fueled act of domination, meant to punish, to degrade, to silence. It was a final act of vengeance. He left her broken, lifeless, on the floor of her own living room. Then he walked out. Like nothing had happened. He drove home, changed his clothes, burned them in a fire pit behind his house, and showed up for church that Sunday with a Bible in hand and a smile on his face. The discovery wasn't made until the next morning. Naomi had tried calling her mother several times with no answer. The kids were asking where Grandma was. She drove over, unlocked the front door, and found the nightmare waiting inside. She collapsed before she could even dial 911. The police arrived within minutes. The scene was horrific. Elaine had been violated and murdered in what investigators later described as one of the most deliberately cruel attacks they'd seen. There were no signs of forced entry. No stolen items. No struggle. Just silence and tragedy. But Elaine had done what many victims don't. She had prepared. In the drawer of her bedroom dresser, police found a flash drive. Inside were years of digital records, emails, voicemails, photos, even a scanned copy of a restraining order she'd never had the chance to file. And there, buried in the folder titled, "In Case Anything Happens," was a note. "If I'm ever found hurt or missing, look at Leonard Jacobs first. He will never stop until he breaks this family." It was all detectives needed to redirect their investigation. Leonard was arrested 2 days later. At first he denied everything. Claimed he hadn't seen Elaine in months. But the digital footprint didn't lie. His phone pinged near Elaine's home the night of the murder. Burned clothing remnants were found in his backyard. DNA evidence confirmed what no one wanted to believe. A pastor, a father, a man of God, had committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Naomi didn't speak publicly for weeks. When she finally did, her voice trembled, but it didn't break. She said her mother died protecting her. That Elaine had warned her, believed her, and stood by her when no one else would. She said Leonard hadn't just killed her mother, he'd destroyed any piece of the man she once thought she loved. The church Leonard once led shut its doors. Congregants left in droves. Some still struggled to accept the truth, but others had known deep down that something had always felt wrong. Leonard Jacobs was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and multiple counts of aggravated assault. He pleaded not guilty. But the evidence spoke for itself. And the trial was only the beginning. The crime Leonard Jacobs committed wasn't just an act of violence. It was an eruption of years of control, bitterness, and obsession. Something dark that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. He was a man who had built his life on appearance, on his voice in the pulpit, his carefully pressed suits, his performative humility. But when the mask came off, when the courts took away his children and his authority was stripped, Leonard didn't pray. He didn't repent. He planned. And on the night of October 14th, he carried out something unspeakable. What happened inside Elaine Carter's home wasn't impulsive. It was premeditated. Calculated. Savage. Using the spare key he had never returned, Leonard quietly entered Elaine's modest home a little after midnight. Her lights were off. Her car in the driveway. She had no reason to be afraid, no reason to expect that a predator was already inside. The timeline pieced together later by investigators painted a horrifying sequence of events. Elaine likely heard the door open. Maybe she assumed Naomi had forgotten something. Maybe she thought it was a neighbor. But by the time she made it to the hallway, Leonard was already inside, face obscured, gloves on. The assault was brutal and personal. Leonard didn't just want to hurt Elaine, he wanted to destroy her. Every action seemed fueled by hatred, by a twisted desire to punish her for everything she'd taken from him. The woman who stood against his manipulation, who testified in court, who had protected Naomi and the children, Leonard wanted to make her suffer. He raped her, an act of dominance, not desire. A weapon. A message. And when she was too broken to fight back, he killed her. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Investigators later found a heavy crystal vase shattered near her body. Bloodied. Smeared. It appeared Leonard had used it as a final blow, smashing it down with such force that fragments embedded into the nearby carpet. There were no signs of struggle. Elaine had been overpowered from the beginning. But she fought back in her own way. Her fingernails had skin under them. She left scratches on Leonard's neck and face, small marks that he tried to cover with makeup when he appeared in church that Sunday. But nothing could cover the truth. The crime scene was a contradiction, spotless on the surface, but hiding a storm underneath. Leonard had attempted to clean. Police noted faint traces of bleach along the kitchen counters. A cleaning rag still damp in the sink. He had tried to erase his presence, But he couldn't erase the evidence he left behind. DNA. His sweat. His fingerprints. His blood. Even his skin cells under Elaine's nails. All of it told the story of a man who thought he was untouchable, but who was finally seen for who he truly was. Leonard returned home that night and set fire to the clothes he had worn. Neighbors later reported seeing a strange glow from his backyard fire pit, the flames unusually high. One even said she saw him standing silently beside the fire, staring at it, unmoving. By morning he was back in pastor mode, shaking hands, hugging parishioners, preaching about God's timing. But his eyes were empty. It wasn't until Naomi discovered Elaine's body that everything began to unravel. Her screams alerted the neighbors. The paramedics, the police, the detectives, they all arrived within the hour. And as they stepped into that home, what they saw chilled them to the core. Elaine, a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting others, her daughter, her grandchildren, had died alone, betrayed by someone she had feared for years. Her body was found curled on her side, near the entrance to the living room, as if she had tried to run. Her hand was outstretched, fingers grasping toward her phone. Inches away. But she never made it. Detectives immediately noticed the lack of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. No drawers rifled through. This wasn't a robbery. It was personal. And when they found the flash drive Elaine had prepared, full of files, warnings, and names, everything clicked. Her note was haunting. If something happens to me, it will be Leonard Jacobs. He will never stop until he breaks this family. It was all investigators needed to zero in. Leonard's phone pinged at a nearby tower just after midnight that night, far from his home and unaccounted for. When questioned by police, he claimed he was asleep the entire night. Alone. No alibi. But the digital evidence said otherwise. One of Elaine's security cameras, a small, barely visible device she had hidden near the back porch, had caught a shadowy figure approaching the house. While the face was obscured, the height, gait, and body shape matched Leonard. A motion-activated light turned on briefly, illuminating the side of his shoe, black leather, worn at the edges, the same pair he was seen wearing earlier that week. Detectives brought Leonard in for questioning. At first he was calm, composed, denied everything, claimed he was being targeted by bitter women and a corrupt system. But when they placed the photos on the table, the shoe, the scratches on his neck, the digital timestamp, his silence spoke volumes. The pastor who once preached redemption had nothing left to say. He was arrested on charges of first-degree murder, rape, unlawful entry, and obstruction of justice. The media swarmed. Headlines exploded. Holy man, unholy crime. Pastor accused of raping and killing mother-in-law. Faith and fury, the Leonard Jacobs case. The story shocked the community. Some refused to believe it. Others whispered that they had always sensed something dark beneath his sermons. But for Naomi, for her children, for everyone Elaine had protected, the truth was now undeniable. Leonard Jacobs, the man who once spoke of heaven, had created his own version of hell. And the courtroom would be where his reckoning began. In the hours following Elaine Carter's murder, the police worked quickly. They had a suspect in mind, a man who had both the motive and the opportunity, Leonard Jacobs. But unraveling the full extent of his crime would take time. What the police didn't know was just how deeply Leonard had woven himself into the fabric of this family's pain. And how, behind his calm exterior, he had already prepared for his own reckoning. The investigation began with a sense of urgency. Naomi, devastated and frantic, had called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived at Elaine's house, it was already too late. Her mother was gone. The scene was horrific, and Naomi was left in a daze, struggling to understand how something so violent, so senseless, could have happened to the woman who had always been her protector. Elaine's house, once a place of comfort, of refuge, was now a crime scene. The investigators took their time, gathering evidence, looking for any clues that would lead them to the killer. It didn't take long for them to notice something odd. There was no forced entry. The door had been unlocked. Nothing appeared to be stolen. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. Inside they found more than just the physical evidence of the crime. They found a digital trail, a flash drive Elaine had hidden in her bedroom drawer, labeled with a simple warning, "If anything happens to me, look at Leonard Jacobs." It was a chilling message, but it was also a gift. It gave the investigators the lead they needed. The flash drive contained numerous files, emails, documents, and recordings, detailing the ongoing custody battle, the years of emotional and physical abuse Naomi had endured, and the controlling nature of Leonard. It was clear that Elaine had known exactly who was responsible for the dangers Naomi had faced, and she had been preparing for the worst. Elaine had taken steps to ensure that, if something happened to her, Leonard wouldn't be able to escape the consequences. The evidence gathered on that flash drive was pivotal. It gave the police the motive and the proof they needed to begin their inquiry into Leonard's involvement. But they needed more. They needed to confirm his whereabouts on the night of the murder. It didn't take long to track Leonard's movements. His phone records revealed that he had been near Elaine's house at the time of the murder. The digital footprint was damning. Leonard's alibi, a vague claim of being at home alone, fell apart when his phone showed it had pinged off a tower close to Elaine's neighborhood just after midnight. Then, investigators turned to a security camera. Elaine had installed small cameras around her house, hoping to protect herself from potential threats. One of those cameras had captured a shadowy figure approaching her back door. While the image wasn't perfectly clear, the body type, gait, and silhouette matched Leonard. It was becoming impossible for Leonard to deny his involvement. But despite the overwhelming evidence, he stuck to his story. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he remained calm, too calm. His demeanor was cold, almost robotic, as he claimed he had no idea what had happened to Elaine. He insisted he hadn't seen her in months, and he denied any involvement in the crime. But the more they questioned him, the more cracks began to appear in his story. When detectives presented Leonard with the photo of his shoe, captured by the security camera, he became defensive. The shoe in the photo was one he'd worn just days earlier, a pair of black leather dress shoes that he hadn't bothered to replace after the crime. He claimed they weren't his, but the forensic team quickly matched the shoes to him. More evidence came to light. Traces of Leonard's DNA were found on Elaine's body, along with his fingerprints in various places around the house. The final blow came when investigators discovered Leonard's burned clothing in his backyard. He had tried to destroy the evidence, clothing stained with Elaine's blood. But it wasn't enough to erase the truth. The police arrested Leonard Jacobs, charging him with first-degree murder, rape, and several counts of aggravated assault. They didn't know it then, but this would become a case that would stun the entire community. A man who had once been revered as a pillar of the church, now revealed to be a cold-blooded killer. The news of Leonard's arrest spread like wildfire. His church, once filled with supporters, began to empty. Congregants, many of whom had trusted him for years, could barely believe the accusations. How could their pastor, the man who had led them in worship and preached about forgiveness, be capable of such a heinous act? Some of them stood by him, claiming that the charges were part of a conspiracy. Others, however, began to question everything they thought they knew about the man who had stood at the pulpit for so long. Naomi, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with the reality of what had happened. Her mother was gone. The man she had once loved as a father had taken her life in a cruel and senseless act. The grief was suffocating, but she also knew that the truth had finally come to light. She wasn't the only one to mourn. Elaine had been the glue holding the family together. She had been the protector, the one who made sure Naomi's children felt safe, who taught them right from wrong, who made sure they knew what real love looked like. Her loss was immeasurable, and Naomi was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by betrayal. As Leonard sat in jail, awaiting trial, the investigation continued. The police pieced together the full scope of his actions, the years of abuse, manipulation, and control. They spoke to more witnesses, former congregants who had seen the cracks in Leonard's pious facade. They uncovered more evidence of his obsession with his children, his need to dominate, to own everything in his life. The investigation revealed that Leonard had been preparing for this moment for months. He had anticipated his downfall. He had planned Elaine's murder as the ultimate act of revenge, an act that would silence her, destroy her family, and make him feel powerful once again. But what he hadn't counted on was the resilience of the women he had hurt. Naomi, Elaine, and the children, they all survived. They all fought to ensure that Leonard would face justice for the horrors he had inflicted upon them. As Leonard waited for his trial, he had no idea what awaited him in the courtroom. The truth had already been laid bare. And the world would soon learn just how far a man's obsession with control and power could go. As the days passed, Leonard Jacobs sat in a small jail cell, staring at the cold concrete walls, awaiting his trial. The evidence against him was undeniable, yet he maintained his innocence, clinging to a story that grew weaker by the day. His world, once filled with adoration and respect, had crumbled. The community that had supported him for years now turned its back, and even his own congregation began to ask the question they never thought they would: how could we have been so blind? But for Naomi, for the children, and for everyone who had known the depth of the pain Elaine had endured, there was only one goal now: justice. The trial of Leonard Jacobs would become a spectacle, one that would unravel the darkness that had lurked behind his public persona for so long. As the courtroom filled with spectators, reporters, and family members, the reality of the case began to settle in. What had once been a small, tight-knit community now found itself grappling with an unimaginable truth: that the man they had trusted, the pastor who had preached to them every Sunday, was a murderer. The prosecution's case was airtight. They presented the damning evidence piece by piece. The flash drive Elaine had left behind, detailing years of abuse and manipulation. Leonard's digital trail, his phone records, his location data, and the security camera footage showing him near Elaine's home the night of her murder. The traces of his DNA found on her body. His burned clothing, remnants of the crime that he had tried so desperately to destroy. The emotional impact of the case was undeniable. Naomi took the stand, her voice trembling as she spoke about the man she had once loved. She described Leonard's hold over her life, the psychological abuse, the way he had manipulated her, used her, and controlled every aspect of her existence. She spoke of the relief she felt when she finally left him, only to find that his obsession with power and control had never ended. "It was like I was never truly free," Naomi said through tears. "He never stopped trying to break me, to take everything from me. And he did the same thing to my mother." Elaine's memory loomed large in the courtroom. A woman who had spent years protecting her daughter, standing by her in the face of adversity. A woman who, in her final moments, had fought back against the very man who had been part of her family, who had taken everything from her. Naomi's words were raw, filled with pain, but also with a quiet strength. A strength that spoke to the power of love, of a mother's protection even in death. The defense, however, took a different approach. Leonard's lawyer argued that the case against him was circumstantial. They claimed there were inconsistencies in the evidence, that the DNA could have been planted, that the surveillance footage wasn't definitive. They painted Leonard as a man caught in the middle of a bitter custody battle, a man who had been wronged by the system, a man who had been pushed to the edge. But the jury wasn't swayed. They had heard Naomi's testimony. They had seen the mounting evidence. They knew the truth. Leonard Jacobs had not been a victim. He had been a predator. And the people who had trusted him, who had believed in him, were now left to reckon with the horror of his actions. As the trial neared its end, the defense's case began to fall apart. The prosecution presented more witnesses, more damning evidence that painted Leonard not just as a man who had snapped in a moment of rage, but as a man who had carefully planned his crime, who had spent months preparing to destroy the very people who had taken away his power. The turning point came when the prosecution presented a piece of testimony from a former church member, someone who had worked closely with Leonard for years. This witness described a man who was obsessed with control, a man who had a history of manipulation, a man who had convinced people that his every word was the truth, no matter how many lies he told. Leonard was a master of manipulation, the witness testified. He could make people believe anything. He had this charm, this presence. But it was all just a facade. Underneath, he was ruthless. He would do anything to maintain control. With that testimony, the jury knew exactly who Leonard Jacobs was. The man who had stood in front of a congregation and preached about forgiveness, about family, and about redemption, was a man who had done nothing but harm, nothing but destroy. The verdict came swiftly. After days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with their decision. Leonard Jacobs stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his face unreadable as the judge read the charges. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Leonard Jacobs, guilty of first-degree murder, rape, and aggravated assault." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Naomi's breath caught in her throat and tears welled in her eyes. It was over. The man who had tried to take everything from her children, from her mother, he was finally being held accountable for his actions. But the verdict, though crucial, couldn't bring back Elaine. It couldn't undo the years of trauma Naomi had suffered. It couldn't fill the empty space left by a woman who had fought so hard for her family. For Naomi, the victory in court was bittersweet. She had won justice, but the loss was still too great. Leonard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His actions would forever mark him as a monster, someone who had betrayed the very trust of his community, his family, and his faith. As Leonard was led away in handcuffs, Naomi stood in the courtroom, her children by her side. They were free now, free from his grip, free from the years of fear and pain. And while the road ahead would be long, the light of justice had finally pierced through the darkness Leonard had created. For Elaine. For Naomi. For the children. It was a hard-earned victory. But it was a victory nonetheless. If you found this story chilling and eye-opening, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. We dive deep into the darkest corners of family crimes and bring you the shocking truth that many would rather keep hidden.